He never imagined that all three of his sons would die on the battlefield at the same time. What shocked him even more was that his wife couldn't bear the pain of losing all three sons at once and lost her sanity, constantly imagining that they were still alive. Every day, she would take out their belongings and wipe them again and again. Connor couldn't bear to destroy her fantasy, so he stayed by her side every day, pretending their sons were still alive. In this unbearable grief, they lived like that for 4 long years, until one day, Connor finally decided to break his wife's illusion, hoping she could return to reality. He firmly asked her to face the truth that their 3 sons had indeed died on the front lines, but his wife, who refused to accept the news, burst into tears and shouted at Connor, accusing him of cursing their own children. Seeing her heartbroken and devastated, Connor couldn't bring himself to hurt her with the truth anymore, so he decided to continue the act with her. Furious, his wife stood up and stormed out of the room. Connor had no idea that the next morning, his wife would completely disappear. He searched frantically, shouting her name, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, he discovered her body floating lifelessly in a nearby pond. Connor rushed into the water, trying desperately to save her, but it was too late. She was already cold and gone. Unable to live with the pain of losing her sons, his wife had chosen to end her suffering. Heartbroken, Connor buried his beloved wife in the church cemetery with his own hands. Then he left his hometown on horseback, determined to find the remains of his 3 sons and bring them home, because he couldn't bear the thought of his boys lying forever in a foreign land, beneath cold, distant soil. After more than 2 long months of travel, he finally reached the area near the Gallipoli Peninsula. He came here because Gallipoli was where his 3 sons had fallen in battle, but upon arrival, he was told that without a permit, no one was allowed to enter the peninsula. Even though the war had ended, Gallipoli was still considered a restricted military zone. While he was speaking with an officer, a young boy suddenly ran off with Connor's luggage. Connor immediately gave chase, running as fast as he could while the boy sprinted ahead. But unfamiliar with the area, Connor soon lost sight of him. As he stood on the street, looking around in confusion, the boy suddenly popped his head out and shouted at him from a distance. Connor quickly started running again, chasing in the direction the boy had gone. It turned out the boy wasn't a thief at all. He was just trying to bring in customers for the inn where his mother worked. Seeing that the boy meant no harm and noticing that it was already getting dark, Connor decided to stay at the small inn. But when he followed the boy inside, carrying his bag, the boy's mother refused to let him stay, claiming there were no rooms available. Connor was completely puzzled by the mother and son's opposite attitudes. Unable to make sense of what was going on, it turned out that the woman's husband had also died during the Gallipoli campaign, and he had lost his life while fighting against the Australian forces, and Connor was Australian. Fortunately, the innkeeper who suddenly appeared didn't know who Connor really was. Since business had been terrible, the owner was eager to take any paying guest, so without hesitation, he handed Connor the room key. Early the next morning, Connor went to the government office to apply for a permit that would allow him to travel to the Gallipoli Peninsula, but his request was firmly denied, as the official explained that Gallipoli was still a restricted military zone, and no civilians were allowed to enter. Connor slowly took out a photo of his 3 sons, pleading with the officer to have pity on a father who had lost all of his children. The officer was clearly moved by Connor's story, but in the end, he still refused his request to visit the peninsula. Disheartened and defeated, Connor had no choice but to leave. If he couldn't bring back the remains of his sons, how could he face his wife? He had sworn at her grave that he would find their 3 sons and bury them beside her. The young boy from the inn saw Connor's sadness, so he brought him to a nearby mosque. There, the boy encouraged him, saying that as long as he didn't give up, his wish would surely come true. Connor silently vowed to himself that no matter what, he would bring his son's remains home. When they returned to the inn, the boy's mother warned Connor to stay away from her son. Her husband had been killed by Australian soldiers, and she didn't want her child spending time with an Australian. But a few days later, when she learned that Connor's 3 sons had all died in the war and that his wife had taken her own life out of grief, her hatred toward him began to fade. Instead, she felt a deep sympathy for him. Thinking about her own husband who had also died on the battlefield, she felt a painful sense of connection to this man who shared her loss. They were both broken souls wandering far from peace, kindred spirits who understood each other's sorrow without needing words. When she learned the real reason Connor had come, she told him that if he couldn't get a permit, there was another way. He could take a ferry to Canakkale province, and there, if he offered enough money, some local fishermen would secretly take him across the strait and land him on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The next morning, Connor left the inn, planning to follow her advice and sneak onto the peninsula. Just as he was about to leave, The boy ran after him and handed him a family photo. The boy only knew that his father had been a soldier at Gallipoli. He didn't know that his father had already died. He begged Connor, saying that if he saw his father, please tell him to come home soon, because both he and his mother missed him deeply. Connor was overwhelmed by the boy's plea. His heart ached, but he promised to deliver the message, knowing full well it was a promise that could never be fulfilled. Soon after, he boarded a fisherman's boat to make the secret crossing, but to his shock, just as he stepped off the boat, soldiers patrolling the peninsula spotted him. He had barely set foot on land before he was surrounded by troops and taken before the commanding officer. Connor explained that he had risked everything to come here, not for any political reason, but only to find the remains of his 3 sons so he could bring them home and bury them beside their mother. The officer told him that the area was filled with collapsed trenches, craters, barbed wire, and countless unexploded shells buried underground, more dangerous than the stones scattered across the beaches. It was still an active military zone, and no civilians were allowed to enter. With that, the officer ordered his men to escort Connor back. But that very afternoon, the officer was astonished to learn that the determined Connor had once again found a way to sneak back onto the peninsula by boat. Moved by his persistence and the unimaginable grief of a father who had lost 3 sons, the officer decided not to expel him this time, since his own mission there was to clear the land of buried explosives and recover the remains of fallen soldiers. The kind-hearted officer allowed Connor to join the digging team each day to search for his sons. As Connor walked across the former battlefield, surrounded by shattered earth and empty craters, he fell into a heavy silence. In his mind's eye, he could almost see his 3 sons, fighting bravely amid the chaos of war. The ground beneath Connor's feet at that very moment was the same place where his 3 sons had lost their lives. Back then, the 3 brothers had been chasing a fleeing enemy officer, when suddenly, the eldest, who was running ahead, was struck by a bomb and fell to the ground. Seeing their brother fall, the second and third sons rushed forward to save him, but before they could reach him, the enemy on the other side brought out a machine gun. Maybe it was the unspoken bond between father and sons, or maybe even heaven took pity on Connor's sorrow, because suddenly, he felt an unexplainable certainty that he was standing right above where his sons were buried. He picked up a wooden stick, stuck it into the ground, and told the soldiers beside him, "My sons are here." As the soldiers dug with all their strength, Connor noticed 2 Turkish officers sitting nearby. These 2 officers had once fought against the same unit that Connor's sons had served, and they were likely the very man who had killed them. They were there to help the British clear the area of buried explosives. Seeing the man who might have taken his sons' lives sitting right beside him, Connor's grief instantly ignited into a burning flame of vengeance boiling in his chest. Just then, the soldiers uncovered 2 sets of remains exactly where Connor had marked. From the identification tags, it was confirmed they were Connor's second and youngest sons, and he saw the bullet holes in their skulls. One of the soldiers said, "Your sons were probably chasing that Turkish officer over there. Judging by the gunshot wounds, it's likely your son was captured and then executed." Before the soldier could even finish speaking, Connor, consumed by rage, charged at the 2 Turkish officers, determined to take revenge for his sons with his own hands. But before he could reach them, one of the Turkish officers struck him down hard with a cross, knocking him to the ground. The British soldiers nearby quickly drew their weapons, stopping the fight. Lying on the ground, Connor shouted furiously at the Turkish officers, "You killed my sons!" But one of them calmly replied, "You sent your sons into our land with guns in their hands. Even if I was the one who killed them, I didn't kill your sons, I killed invaders who came to our country." Hearing that, Connor was speechless. In the end, 2 British soldiers pulled him away from the site. The British officer who had allowed Connor to stay on the island came over and tried to comfort him, saying, "Your sons were soldiers, they died on the battlefield. Even if that Turkish officer did shoot them, he was only fulfilling his duty as a soldier. If there must be hatred between you, it is a hatred between nations, not between families." Connor stood silent, lost in thought. Then the officer told him something that reignited a flicker of hope. "We found the remains of your second and youngest sons, but not your eldest. That means your eldest son might still be alive." For a man who had believed all his sons were gone, it was like seeing light after endless darkness. The next morning, the same Turkish officer who had fought against his sons came to find Connor. He revealed that he had spent the entire day sending telegrams, searching for Connor's missing son. Holding a list, he told Connor, "There's a name on our prisoner records that's very similar to your eldest son's. It could be him, the one you've been looking for." This strengthened Connor's belief that his eldest son was still alive. For weeks afterward, Connor searched everywhere for clues, but found nothing. Then, a British officer told him that during the war, The Turks had set up a prisoner camp to hold captives, but near the end of the war, that camp had mysteriously vanished, and Turkey had never provided an explanation. The officer added, "It's been so long since the war ended. If your son hasn't returned home by now, there's only one explanation: he didn't make it out of that camp alive." Those words crushed the fragile hope Connor had clung to, plunging him back into despair. But even if there was only one chance in 10 million, as a father, Connor refused to give up. He set out on a long and difficult journey to find his eldest son. After more than 3 months of searching, he still had no results until the same Turkish officer who had once helped him with the prisoner list came to find him again. The officer told him that after asking around for days, he had learned that Connor's son had indeed been captured and sent to a camp located in Afyon. But what happened to him after he arrived there no one knew. At this moment, the Turkish officer was preparing to lead a troop of several dozen soldiers to the border, where they planned to resist the Greek army's advance, and their destination happened to be near Afyon. In order to continue searching for his son, who might still be alive, Connor decided to join the Turkish officer and boarded the train heading toward the border. Before they even reached their destination, Connor saw countless displaced Turkish civilians wandering along the tracks, their homes destroyed by the border war. The soldiers on the train began to check their weapons, ready to defend their homeland with their lives and prevent the Greek army from seizing their territory. But before they could arrive, the engineer suddenly noticed that obstacles had been placed on the tracks, forcing him to pull the brakes and stop the train. Alert and cautious, the officer immediately peered out of the window. Sensing danger, he quickly ordered his men to pull down the canvas blinds and prepare for battle. At that very moment, deadly bullets came whistling toward the train, followed by violent explosions. The Turkish soldiers, caught in the open like targets, suffered heavy losses. After a fierce round of shelling, armed rebels supported by the Greek forces closed in rapidly from all directions. Although the Turkish officer led his men in a desperate counterattack, they were vastly outnumbered and eventually captured. Knowing his fate was sealed, the officer told the rebel leader that Connor was a prisoner he had captured and that he was actually one of their allies. It was his final attempt to save Connor's life before his own death. The rebel leader eventually agreed to let Connor go, but the Turkish officer and the other captured soldiers were to be executed on the spot. At the critical moment, Connor made a bold decision. He couldn't just watch the officer who had shown him nothing but kindness be killed. Grabbing a wooden stick, he used the swirling dust as cover and attacked several armed men from behind just as they raised their guns. After a violent struggle, Connor managed to rescue the officer. Together, they crawled under the train and escaped to the other side, then mounted a horse and rode away at full speed. The furious rebel leader fired wildly at them, but miraculously, none of the bullets hit. They finally managed to escape alive. On their way, Connor finally asked the question that had been haunting him: why had the officer risked so much to help him search for his son? The officer remained silent for a few seconds, then slowly explained. His only son had also died in a past war, and when he looked at Connor, he saw himself. He envied Connor for still having the chance to find his missing son. As a father who had lost his child, he wanted to help Connor with all his strength. While they were still on the run, they stumbled upon a small town. Suddenly, Connor spotted a windmill, one that looked almost identical to the one from his homeland. He became certain that his son must have built it. Overcome with emotion, he climbed up the windmill and shouted his son's name again and again. The officer began asking the locals who had built the windmill, and eventually, they found the man responsible. Seeing the familiar figure in the distance, Connor's emotions surged uncontrollably. He had long believed that all 3 of his sons had died at the front, but now his eldest was standing right before his eyes, alive. That overwhelming feeling of losing everything, then suddenly finding hope again, was beyond words. Connor slowly walked toward his son, calling out to him, but the young man didn't turn around or respond. Only after a long moment did he finally turn his head, and it truly was the son Connor had been searching for all this time. Their reunion felt like a miracle. As if time itself had frozen, the 2 men embraced tightly, unable to speak, their hearts filled with emotions too deep to express. But when Connor said he wanted to take his son home, the young man shook his head, refusing to return. Seeing the pain on his son's face, Connor sensed that something heavy was weighing on his heart. After Connor's repeated questioning, his son finally revealed the reason he hadn't gone home. During the war, while chasing an enemy officer, he was hit by an explosion and fell to the ground. His 2 younger brothers, seeing him wounded, rushed toward him to help, but the enemies in the trenches suddenly turned their machine guns on them. The second brother was killed instantly, and the third was badly wounded and dying. Helpless and injured, the eldest brother could only lie there, watching in horror as his youngest brother cried out in pain. The boy's wounds were fatal, and he begged his older brother to end his suffering quickly. As the eldest, who had sworn to protect his brothers, he couldn't bring himself to do it. But as the cries grew weaker and more desperate, he finally raised his gun, tears streaming down his face. Afterward, he was captured by enemy forces and sent to a prison camp. When the war finally ended, he was released, one of the few survivors, but his two brothers had died because of him, especially the fact that he had been forced to end his youngest brother's life. That became a wound that would never heal. He couldn't face his father or himself, so he chose to hide here, pretending he had died with his brothers. When Connor learned the truth, his heart broke completely, but as a father, he fought back his tears and told his son gently that no matter what had happened, they would always be his children. He said, "You must live a happy life, not just for yourself, but also for your brothers." Just then, gunfire suddenly erupted outside the town. The rebels who had attacked the train had followed Connor all the way here. The town's militia immediately launched a fierce counterattack. The Turkish officer, who had devoted himself to helping Connor, finally fulfilled his promise. He bid Connor farewell and rode away into the distance. Connor's son urged him to escape quickly, but Connor refused to leave without him. He said, "I've already lost your mother and your two brothers. You're my only family now. Either you come home with me, or I'll stay and die here with you." At last, the son gave in. Together, they ran toward the hillside behind the town, but the rebel leader spotted them and ordered his men to fire. Bullets rained down as father and son fled up the slope, finally leaping into the river. Swept away by the rushing current, they narrowly escaped. A few days later, Connor returned to the inn where he had been staying, this time with his son by his side. The young boy ran into his arms with joy, and at that moment, Connor finally saw the boy's mother again. Their gentle smiles hinted that a new chapter in their story was about to begin. I'm a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.